From the Gemini Man by Richard Steinberg, Chapter 10. Ghislaine walked up the rickety stairs to the attic. His level of dread and foreboding increased with every step as he approached the room reserved for the special patrons of his private club. The room had a dark history, and the occupants often had to pay a high price to have their messes cleaned up after they left. Telltale stains would be removed from carpets, or the carpeting itself would be replaced. The source of the stains would either be handsomely paid off, or deposited from some dark bank into the icy green waters of the Isar River. Green, Ghislaine often thought, for the color of the money that would be paid on each occasion that a pre-dawn visit ended with the quiet splash of a rolled-up carpet, weighted down with the remains of an unfortunate who would never be missed. But the man who would soon come to the room was different from any that had come before. The usual patrons of the room were powerful men. Wealthy heads of multinational corporations or high political officials. Controlling men with the need to be completely out of control, if only for a night, an hour, a moment. And for the right price, they were guaranteed their men, women, children, animals, with no rules, no laws, no judgments, either moral or legal, to hinder their enjoyment of the experience. But the man who would soon come to the room had no such need to be out of control. A man who balanced on the thinnest of edges between control and chaos and never ever toppled one way or the other. Just over 2 weeks earlier it had begun. It had been almost noon, the middle of the night, to the sex club proprietor. Ghislaine was asleep in the master suite of his expensive, heavily secured home outside Munich. The children were in school, his wife somewhere downstairs puttering around. Suddenly, to this day, he had no clear idea why he awoke, certain that something was very wrong. He sat bolt upright in his bed and looked around. His wife, Frida, was standing by the foot of the bed, staring at him with a strange expression. Friedy, was ist los? She didn't move, didn't speak, just stood there, eyes wide open, darting to her left. Ghislaine slowly turned to his right. A man with a pleasant expression on his pale face stood there, pointing a sawed-off shotgun at Frida's head. "If you move," the man said in a relaxed voice, "your children will come home to discover pieces of you both sticking to the wall." He spoke in schoolboy German with an American accent. Ghislaine remained stock still. "I have money," he began slowly, "in the safe, maybe 30,000 marks. Also my wife's jewelry. Take it all, we will not fight." He worked hard to keep his voice rock steady. "Thank you, I will," the man said evenly, "if it comes to that. But I'd much rather add to your safe than lighten it." He paused. "I have a business proposition for you." "I do not discuss business with guns pointed at my wife," Ghislaine had been surprised to hear himself say. "You will today," had been the man's soft reply. "Why?" The man had shrugged. "Because I'm the one pointing the gun." The ease, the casualness of the way the man spoke caused the hairs on the back of Ghislaine's neck to stand up. For the next 15 minutes, the man spoke in detail about what he wanted and what he was willing to do for it. At some point, the man, sensing that Ghislaine's fear had been replaced by intrigue, lowered the shotgun. After 25 minutes, Ghislaine ordered his wife to make coffee and say nothing to anyone. After 45 minutes, the bargain had been struck. The man wanted a full set of identity papers of the highest quality, the kind that would withstand the closest visual scrutiny. He wanted 3 men located, not picked up, not killed, which would have been cheaper, just found. Most of all, he wanted a place where, as he put it, I can conduct my business with the men he was seeking. And he offered the most extraordinary thing in return. Payment of a kind that the very audacity of the offer made it almost irresistible. Ghislaine had made the deal instantly. In fact, he'd had no choice, for he knew that the pleasant-faced man would kill both him and his wife without a thought if he was refused. Besides, Ghislaine had thought at the time, once the man was out of the house, he could always be given over to the police, or others of Ghislaine's acquaintance. But deep down he felt that the man was no lunatic or boastful hood trying to impress, and he knew without a word being said what the cost would be if he ever crossed up the smiling, pleasant man. As for the man's method of introducing himself, well, that one simple act of getting past 3 armed security guards and through an elaborate alarm system, all in a heavily patrolled, gated community in the middle of the day, was as eloquent a letter of introduction as Ghislaine could imagine. That had all been 17 days ago, and things had gone even better than the smiling man had promised. Each of the 5 clubs in the playground that were real competition for Ghislaine had suffered major accidents, forcing them to close down. The Erotica had burned to the ground. The Pleasure Spa had suffered from natural gas explosions. Bacchus' playground had experienced a wave of unexplained mechanical failures that injured 12. Limousine patrons of 2 other clubs had been photographed by an unknown source who had released some of the photos to the newspapers. The clubs had quickly been abandoned by their customers, then their owners. And most of the 5 clubs' patrons, especially the late-night limousine trade, which would go nowhere near the slightest possibility of notoriety, had ended up at Ghislaine's. His business increased 5-fold. He'd had to put on more girls, bartenders, was even thinking of expanding into the building next door to deal with the increased traffic. But now it was time for the devil to collect his due. Ghislaine stopped at the attic landing, straightened his tie, smoothed back his hair, and unlocked the door. The room was furnished as an expensive, sophisticated master suite. A Victorian 4-poster bed was the centerpiece of plush carpets, mahogany antique furniture, and lush wallpaper. Designer lamps brightly lit the room, reflecting of the finest gilt mirrors in Germany. A dressing room and full bath suite stood off to one side. Ghislaine saw all of this in a second, was satisfied that all was as it should be, then walked across the thick carpet. He pulled aside the heavy velvet curtains, pulled up the shade behind it, exposing the heavily barred windows. Searching in his pocket, he came up with a large old-fashioned stick key, with which he unlocked the window, then the barred grate that protected the outside. Briefly, almost expectantly, he looked down into the alley below, but could see nothing. It didn't comfort him. He hurriedly closed the window, lowered the shade, and returned the heavy curtains to their original position. He left the light on, the door unlocked. As he quickly climbed down the 3 flights of stairs to the street, he let himself out a side exit of the club. Moving around the back of the building into the alley, he stopped at a point directly beneath the attic room. He looked around but could only see garbage cans, locked doors, and the occasional scurrying rat. He checked his watch. It was 5 minutes to 1 in the morning. "It is Ghislaine," he said softly. "I am here." There was no answer. "Apollyon, it is Ghislaine. I have news." Again, no answer. A moment later, movement in one of the doorways caught his attention. He watched stunned as the smiling man he had come to know as Apollyon slowly emerged from the shadows. "Glad to hear it," was all Newman said. He gestured to the club owner, who reluctantly walked over. In the dim light of the alley, Ghislaine noticed that Newman had put on about 10 pounds in the 3 weeks he'd known him. His skin was darker, with the healthy tan replacing the pallor. He was also well on his way to growing a beard and mustache. "The third man," Ghislaine began, handing over the pencil sketch of Tabard. "A girl in the Reich district spotted him." Newman looked at the sketch. "Good." "I caused inquiries to be made," Ghislaine said too quickly as the dark, the alley, and the presence of this man who reeked of lethality combined to reinforce every fear, real or imagined, the brothel owner had ever had. "Once every week to 10 days, your man arrives at a cafe for a rendezvous with another man. They stay, talk for about an hour, then leave separately. I have no information on the other man except that he is supposed to be a dealer in Russian icons. I am causing further inquiries to be made." He self-consciously wiped his sweaty palms on his pants. Newman nodded, of course. Suddenly he changed into what Ghislaine recognized with some relief as his friendly mode. "How's business?" The older man grinned. "Never better. We are, how do you Americans say, standing room only almost every night." He paused. "Our program of public relations has been even more successful than you had said it would be." He laughed lightly. Newman smiled. "We aim to please," he said casually. "I come from an old established firm, and we appreciate a satisfied customer. Besides," his voice started to drift away, as it sometimes did, "feels good to work again." He looked off into the distance as if completely caught up in a memory. Suddenly he realized that Ghislaine was staring at him. "Your wife and children," he said with a half-smile. "How are they doing?" Not for a moment did Ghislaine feel soothed by the relaxed expression on the smiling face. The simple, polite question sent chills through him. "Fine," he said quickly, returning to the business at hand. "I also have good news of your papers." "Glad to hear it." Newman sensed the man's nerves. "If there's no problem, you've got nothing to worry about. Relax." Ghislaine took a small piece of paper out of his pocket. "As requested, your name will be Charon Apollyon, I don't think that's how it's spelled. I think it was CHY. A naturalized Greek-American citizen from New York. City." He paused. "Are you sure you wish to use such a unique name? It could cause unwanted attention." "Just the opposite," Newman said as he read over Ghislaine's shoulder. "The more bizarre the name, the less attention the immigration people pay. You want to get stopped, use Joe Smith." Ghislaine shrugged. "As you say." He reached into his jacket and handed across a sealed envelope. "These are the credit cards, club membership cards, and other New York State and civic papers you requested." "The others?" Newman asked as he opened the envelope and sorted through it. "Driver's license and social security card in 2 days. The passport maybe then, maybe a day later." They both looked up as Ghislaine's cellular phone began to ring. He answered it quickly. "Ja?" A long pause. "Ein Moment." He turned to Newman. "The first man, he has arrived." Newman nodded, then walked toward the club. "Delay him." Ghislaine spoke hurriedly into the phone, then switched it off. "Everything is as you requested," he said uneasily in Newman's direction. "Good." A long silence enveloped the alley. Finally, Newman walked back, smiling at Ghislaine. "I'll need the remaining ID in 2 days, no longer." Of course. I'll call you with the place and time later this evening. Something was changing in the man. He seemed slightly upset, slightly tense, almost like an athlete in the moments before a championship match. Shall I have him brought up? Newman looked around the alley, checking out the club exterior wall, the metal lacework fire escape. Finally, he nodded. Fine. Ghislaine switched on his cellular. Imagine the coincidence, he said as he dialed. The first man you sought already being a member of my club. Newman walked over to the base of the fire escape, moving a garbage can over as he did. He estimated the distance from the top of the can to the base of the suspended ladder, then nodded to himself. Suddenly, he seemed to remember that Ghislaine was still there. From such coincidences, he said with a private smile, the erotica's ashes blow away and your club thrives. Newman watched the nervous club owner hurry away, casting anxious looks over his shoulder. When he'd gone, Newman looked up the length of the fire escape, ending at the attic room's window. In his head, he did the calculations. 2 minutes for Beck to go through the formalities of making his selection for the evening. 5 minutes more for him to be escorted up the 3 flights of stairs. Another 3 minutes for the girl to arrive. Ghislaine had briefed Newman on the general's proclivities, and Newman himself had talked to 2 of the girls that had serviced Beck in the past. Four more minutes for the charade to play itself out to the point that Newman wanted. 14 minutes in total. He looked at his watch, 1:03 a.m. He melted back into the doorway to continue his wait and his think. He knew that he was being incredibly stupid for pursuing this private agenda. It entailed massive risks, depleted his resources, which, after the club hits, now stood around 30,400 marks. Parentheses, about $23,000, most of, USD, most of which he would need for his eventual escape, close parentheses, and exposed him needlessly to the possibility of arrest or death. In the long run, it would accomplish nothing, not even serve a need for vengeance that he didn't feel anyway. But he'd known that he had to do it almost from the first moments of his freedom. Sitting quietly in the upper branches of the heavily leafed tree, he'd watched the search for him grow. First, Edel's security men, then, about an hour later, the better-trained, highly disciplined military teams. Twice in the first 3 hours, he heard them come to a stop just below his tree. The leaves were too thick for them to see him, or for him to see them, for that matter. But he had heard them, though he'd largely ignored their presence, feeling safe and secure in his hidden perch. He'd allowed his mind to wander, to analyze and muse over the various courses his life could take from that moment forward. He knew that eventually the searchers would move on and that he would be free, but free to do what? Initially, he thought of heading south into Austria, from there maybe Yugoslavia, a small, chaotic, Adriatic port, and a slow boat home to the States, where he could disappear into one of the giant melting pots that he could move in comfortably. He thought of heading east to Spain, losing himself in the olive groves and peaceful quiet of Catalonia. In fact, when he dropped from the tree, he hadn't made up his mind which way to go. Beck's man changed that. The implications of that one futile act, that pointless message sent by Beck, raised so many questions in Newman's mind that it instantly altered all of his planning and thoughts. And the message was unquestionably clear. If Newman could not be contained, he must be killed. But it didn't make sense. Agents had gone rogue before, many of them far more important than he was. Killing was always the last option, only after all other options had been tried and exhausted in an attempt to recover the missing man or woman. But Beck had gone to the stick first. Why? Newman posed no threat to any ongoing intelligence operations. Beck and the government knew that he could never be made to compromise any intelligence networks still in place, and he bore them no serious animosities. Well, not enough to have him killed over. But Beck had tried anyway, and Beck never did anything without higher sanction, which begged the question, why? He remembered looking back at the corpse of the victim Beck had set in his path and wondering, what was it that he possessed that made him such a threat? What was the reason behind his bizarre incarceration and now the death hunt? The thought had continued rattling around inside him as he left the grounds. He'd casually walked away from the Institute, hitchhiking a ride from a friendly Belgian trucker as far as Freising, about 40 kilometers north of Munich. The man had even loaned Newman 40 marks, about $30 American. He'd spent those first few days hiding in a drainage pipe just outside the city. At night he would walk or hitch his way into the small farming town to get the lay of the land. But his mind never wandered far from the question that plagued him throughout his daylight hours of semi-sleep, deep in the damp, cool mildew of the pipe. Why? By his third day he decided, knowing that it was the wrong thing to do, that he had to find the answer before he left. He quickly used up the 40 marks on food and basic clothing, so he put his search aside and concentrated on taking care of the most immediate business. If he was going to stay, he'd need more money and a more permanent, safer place to live. On nights 4 through 6, a series of late-night burglaries was reported in the Freising business district. The small German businessman's propensity for keeping locked boxes with large amounts of cash in them fit well with his plans, and after his 5th illegal entry, he took his 1,815 marks, just under $1,400, and headed for the town closest to the Institute. He rented a small, dilapidated grocery store in a rundown poor section for 900 marks. No questions were asked by the absentee landlord. The landlord owned the entire block of stores, and they had been mostly vacant. Ever since the recession hit after the wall came down, the entire transaction had been accomplished through the mail and over the phone. The location was perfect. The neighborhood was quiet and mostly deserted. The few stores that were open functioned merely as fronts for the Turkish drug dealers and anarchists who rented them. Newman liked that. These were people who would ask no questions, were not likely to help out when, inevitably, the searchers came around. He had no illusions about the searchers. Right now he was behind them, but before they abandoned the hunt, they would recheck every trail once more. They would begin by canvassing and recanvassing all hotels, lodges, hostels, but would eventually get around to the storefronts. The trick would be in the timing. The grocery quickly became his base of operations, fully stocked with 2 weeks of dried fruit, a first aid kit, clothes, and basic weapons. Parentheses both purchased and stolen. The walls were filled with carefully marked maps as well as intricately designed charts. By night he surveilled the Institute, often taking the inordinate risk of actually walking in the front door and breaking into offices, reading the files within. By day, he would fill out his charts, staring at them on the walls for hours, trying to find the pattern, the secret message that would lead him where he had to go. Still, he'd been unable to find his answer, but he was close. Hastily photocopied memoranda read at his leisure back at the grocery. Sketched out that there was quote, a theory of unusual definition, quote, about him. And it appeared that this theory, although clearly controversial, was driving the government's actions. He watched Patricia in her office on rounds, driving to and from work. He'd thought of her theory, the one that had gotten her temporarily replaced, and he wondered if it was the same as the one mentioned in the memos. Once he'd even stood in her bedroom, over her sleeping form, and thought about forcing the answer from her. He knew that it would be easy to do, but that it would be an irrevocable step that could only energize his pursuers, and he'd been unwilling to do that then. So he had settled for a brief reading of the contents of her briefcase, some outline for a paper on something she called Homo crudelis, cold-hearted man. He quickly put it aside, finding the concept interesting mental masturbation, but not relating to his problem at hand. Then, with a mischievous smile, he had an idea. Patricia awakened to find a flower on the pillow beside her head. Fear was almost immediately replaced by exhilaration. 3 nights in the next 5, a silent, invisible intruder had visited her, each time leaving a flower, each time rifling her briefcase. For the first time, she felt in complete control of the situation that she kept to herself, and she began to record her thoughts in a secret journal she kept locked in her files at the Institute. Newman is scared, she wrote, alone, reaching out to the one person in the world he feels a bond with. A connection, probably sexual, has been established between subject and therapist. It is a fragile thing, but if properly nourished, parentheses, the therapist's physical well-being borne in mind, close parentheses, it might eventually yield the clearest picture of the subject yet. And she'd begun doing her part to ease the nourishment. More detailed papers from her reports were kept in her briefcase for her semi-nightly visitor's education. She slept lighter when she slept, wearing the more feminine, sexier, more revealing night things she was sure Newman preferred. Thought about approaching him many times when she'd hear him prowling through the house, or just opening her eyes when she felt his presence above her. The next move belonged to Newman, she thought, believed, hoped, but the visits eventually dwindled, and she began to miss the flowers as she mourned the end of yet another of Clinical Patty's relationships. For his part, Newman watched, read, concealed himself during the day, sought his answers by night, until that one night just over 2 weeks after his escape, when by sheerest luck he had stumbled across Beck walking into the Devil's Playground. Newman, whose cash was beginning to run low, had come to the red light district in search of some easy victims who carried cash and were unlikely to report a robbery. While sizing up a likely prospect, she was stunned to see the general, top coat collar pulled up to help hide his identity, walk right past him. All thoughts of money disappeared as he immediately became a faint shadow in the general's wake. He watched as the general went into Eastland's club. He waited 2 hours until the general had come out again, looking pale and spent. He'd spent the last of his money on bribes to find out about the club, about Ghislaine, and for the bus ride out to Ghislaine's suburban home. And the plan had been put into effect. He looked around the alley. It was still deserted. Checking his watch, he counted 5 minutes to go. He walked over, standing next to the garbage can under the ladder. Ghislaine had always been the big question, but Newman had come to realize that the man was completely without scruples, or morality. Exactly the type Newman needed right now. He knew that eventually the man would betray him. It was written across his face in bright green dollar signs. But that was acceptable. At least it would be an honest betrayal born of greed, not political expedience. And even that betrayal would, in its way, contribute to Newman's overall plans. He smiled as he climbed on top of the can. It was 1:15. Time to begin. Beck liked the attic room, but he still felt uneasy about it. Never having been there before, he'd walked through every inch of it, assuring himself that there were no hidden cameras or microphones. Finally satisfied, he sat down in an antique rocker to wait for the girl. He was tired. Gosh, was he tired? He felt it in every sinew of his body and every fiber of his brain. He wasn't sleeping, had virtually stopped eating, was falling apart in most every way, but somehow he held at least the appearance of sanity together by sheer force of will. It hadn't been easy. Since Newman's escape, he'd been tortured by waking nightmares of a demonic Newman, stalking an unsuspecting world, striking randomly. Beck would always be one step behind him, always coming upon the dismembered, decomposing corpses as they exhaled their last breaths. And all of them would look into his soul with their dead eyes, silently accusing and damning him to hell eternal. So he had returned to Ghislaine's club. The girl's soft knock on the door caused him to flinch. He pulled himself together, straightened his jacket, and took a deep breath. "Come in." She was young, not more than 20. Her sweet, open face, shiny blonde hair, firm, full body beneath the conservative clothes were all that he had asked for and more. "I am sorry to have kept you waiting," she said sweetly, as she walked over, extending her hand. "How might I help you out this evening?" Beck slowly reached out, taking her hand in his, squeezing it tightly. "I'm not sure you can," he said in a voice hoarse from lust and pain combined into one unnamed black emotion. "Please, sir," she said demurely, "you may tell me anything." He pulled her close, grabbing her buttocks, forcing her against his face. She squirmed uncomfortably. "Sir, please, this is not right." He began to pull at her. She struggled, suddenly losing her balance, toppling onto the floor. He fell on top of her as she began to fight. "Bitch," he said as he began to tear at her clothes. "You little tease. You think you can analyze me? Can get inside my head." He tore her blouse off and began to pull up her skirt, not bloody likely. He tore at her exposed breasts. At that moment, flushed with excitement, with rage, his skin beat red as he reached the climax of his assault on the seemingly defenseless girl. He felt a gentle, cool night breeze reach out and brush his cheek. It was so unexpected that it distracted him for a moment, but he quickly ignored it and returned to the girl. "Call me Newman," he growled. "Brian Newman." "That could get a little confusing," a familiar voice said from the corner of the room. Beck froze. His eyes searched the room until he spotted Newman standing by the velvet curtains, a sad expression on his face. The girl quietly gathered her clothes and left the room, closing the door behind her. For a full minute, the two men just stared at each other. Then Beck slowly came to a sitting position. Newman walked deeper into the room, coming to a stop between Beck and the door. He saw Beck sneak a glance at his topcoat, which lay across the foot of the bed. He smiled as he simultaneously recognized the bulge in the coat and the look in the general's eyes. "You'll never make it," Newman said casually. "You know me. You know what I mean." Beck bit his lower lip, seemed to give in to the inevitable, then launched himself toward the bed. Newman's heel caught the general in the small of the back, driving him painfully to the floor, inches short of the gun in his coat. Desperately, Beck reached for it again, only to have his spread fingers casually grabbed by the man behind him, then bent painfully back. As he was forced to a sitting position, Newman's knee slammed into the older man's face. Beck collapsed in a broken pile of blood and irredeemable sins at Newman's feet. He turned back to Newman, his enemy/friend, student/creation, a look of soulful pain, terror, and relief in his rheumy eyes. "Are you done?" Newman's voice was calm, sad, almost patronizing. Beck was quiet for a long time. "Are you going to kill me?" Newman shrugged while he studied the man on the floor. "Interesting little scene just now." Beck wanted to look away, wanted to disappear into the thick carpet and never be seen again. Instead, he just continued looking at Newman. Newman took the .45 from Beck's coat, then casually sat down in an antique rocker by the door. "You'll have to forgive me, my Freudian analysis skills aren't what they once were." He paused. "Is this wish fulfillment or a latent desire to be punished for your sins?" No answer. "Oh, come on," he chided. "Don't be a spoilsport. Which is it?" He sounded genuinely amused. "What do you want?" Beck choked out. "A great many things, I assure you. Care to be more specific?" After a long silence, Newman was clearly not going to break. Beck shook his head. "You'll never get away." "But I already have, or didn't you notice? By the way, just for the record, what was his name?" "Who?" Beck looked confused, then he suddenly understood. "Oh," a pause. "Leonard Pelican. He had a wife and 3 children, in case you'd like that for the record also," the general spit out. Newman seemed unimpressed. "Hope he was insured." Newman shook his head slowly as he looked unblinkingly at his former commander. "What the hell happened to you in the last 6.5 years? His voice took on an edge of genuine concern, laced with pity. Beck looked down at the carpet. "I got old. Bullshit. I got tired. Bullshit." Beck looked up at him, his eyes beginning to water just a little bit. "I got used up. That I believe. Can I get up?" Newman nodded and gestured at the chair across from him. He smiled as Beck fixed his clothes, stood, then sat down in the chair. "How'd it happen?" Newman asked, his tone sounding sincere. Beck shrugged. "Too many years fighting other people's wars, I guess. Too many friends buried in unmarked graves in unreachable places. Too many shared memories of their pain. Too much blood, too many bodies. Too much, period." "Touching," Newman said, suppressing a laugh. "I can just picture it. The sensitive colonel, forgive me, general, grieving over the loss of his men, feeling their pain, living their horrors." He paused, his face taking on a grim look. "Funny, I don't remember seeing you in any of my cells." "I tried to get you out," Beck said softly. Newman ignored him. "I looked for you, you know? When they began, what was it they call it?" He thought for a moment. "Ah, yes, the audit sessions, that's it." He leaned forward. "They would begin their audit sessions, and I'd look for you. They'd attach their electrodes to my balls, and I'd look for you. The needles with their who knows what spiking into my veins, and I'd look for you. The heating elements tied to the bottoms of my feet, and I'd look for you." He paused as if deep in memory. "The chandelier, and I would most definitely look for you." His voice dropping low and dangerous. "God, how I wanted to share all of that with you." Beck was trembling slightly. "I don't understand," he said softly. "The chandelier." Newman's face brightened. "You mean you don't know? It wasn't in the reports or the files you got from our dear new friends, the Russians? He smiled, standing up in front of Beck. Well, let me give you a full report. You don't have to, Beck said mournfully, as a muscle in his cheek began twitching uncontrollably. But I do. What kind of toy soldier would I be if I didn't? Newman looked around the room. Finally spotting what he was looking for. He walked over to the curtains and ripped down a long length of curtain cord. He carried it back over to Beck, tying a slip knot in each end as he did. It's an interesting little game that my interrogators like to play whenever they thought my attention was lagging. He held the two ends in front of Beck. Stand up, he said pleasantly. Please don't, Beck said in a scared, almost childlike voice. Stand up. Slowly, Beck stood. Newman put his arm around the man's shoulders and led him to the center of the room. Now, the first thing they did was throw the middle of the rope over a chandelier hook. Newman lightly tossed the cord over a bare hook in the ceiling that he had installed several days before. Then they would tie one of the loops around my right wrist. He did it as he talked, and the other around my left ankle. He tucked the gun in his belt as he held the loose end of the cord out to Beck. If you'd please, General. Newman stood on his right foot, raising his left leg behind him about 2.5 feet off the floor. Beck just stood there, precariously balancing on legs that seemed about to give way. Come on, General, it's your big chance. I'll be completely at your mercy. He smiled, but the grin was not at all comforting. Do it, he commanded. Beck slowly took the cord and, with shaking hands, pulled it around Newman's upraised left ankle. Good. Make it tight now. Newman seemed completely relaxed. It takes a while to work, but I think you can understand the principle behind it. Eventually, my right leg gives out and I drop my left foot. This pulls my arm up sharply, threatening to rip it out of the socket. His eyes were locked with Beck's. I'm at your mercy, General. Beck didn't move. Just like I was with our new friends, the Russians, Newman said coldly. There's nothing I can do. I'm all yours. You can stand there and wait until my leg gives out. Then you can watch me swing here for a while. Or you can call the hunters, have them come, wrap me up and take me away. Beck's trembling was sweeping through his body. He took a step toward the door, stopped, took a step toward Newman, and stopped. Sweat poured from his body, staining his shirt, dripping onto the carpet, stinging his eyes. Come on, Alex, this is your big break. Make the call. Newman paused. Or maybe you'd rather take back your great big gun and kill me yourself. Beck had been staring down at the floor. His head snapped up at the statement. What? Go ahead, Newman said in a seductive whisper. Do it. Blow my brains all over this nice blue carpet. Make pretty patterns with my guts all over the wall. Come on, be a sport. Be a pal. He paused. Be a hero. Beck's trembling suddenly stopped. He straightened, took several deep labored breaths, then took a step toward Newman. Good, Newman coaxed. Just a few more feet. Beck started to reach out, tried to extend his arm down to the gun. He reached out with his other arm, with both arms, tried desperately to reach it. Sweat poured off his fingers. His mouth opened and closed spasmodically. His breath came in short gulps. His eyes glazed over. Newman shook his head as he watched the scene. It's okay, Alex, he said in a soothing tone. It's okay, old man. Beck's shoulders slumped. A moment later, he had removed the cord from around the younger man's ankle. Newman never took his eyes off the destroyed man in front of him. He slowly loosened the loop around his wrist. You know, Alex, after tonight, we'll never see each other again. I know. And there's something I want you to know before we go any further. Yeah, Beck looked as though he'd been awake for a century. Newman put his hand on Beck's shoulder. Yes, he paused. I'm not your fault. Both men were quiet for a long time. Finally, Beck broke the silence. Thank you, he said weakly. Newman smiled a friendly smile. Then he held out the cord to the general. Shall we begin? Beck looked at the cord, took it, and slowly put it around his wrist.